Hello, class. This is Jack Davin coming at you from Texas. I hope y'all's quarantine is going well. I'm doing a presentation today on Italy and Germany's involvement in the Spanish Civil War and their support of the nationalist government. So, moving on to slide number 2, I just wanted to give a brief background on what fascism is as an ideology. So, fascism is an ideology that supports extreme and far right thinking and advocates for authoritarian leadership and ultranationalist ideals. It supports rule through a single dictator who has complete control over the economy and general society of their nation. It also involves forced suppression of the opposition to fascism, primarily for socialists and supporters of a democratic government. World War I was initially seen as the perfect opportunity for fascism to rise, and many fascists saw war as the opportunity to end European monarchies and revolutionize the entire continent under one ideology. And because of this, several fascist movements began to grow over the decades after the Great War. On to slide number 3. The first fascist movement, many think it was Germany and the Nazis, but Italy was actually the birthplace of the ideology of fascism. Benito Mussolini was a radical socialist before World War I, and after the Great War, he saw an opportunity to use war to spark to ignite revolution throughout all of Europe. His fellow socialists believed that his views were too extreme and led him to create his own ideology known as fascismo, which ended up being called fascism in the future. The Italian people felt that they didn't get much after World War I and had little faith in their government at the time. So they rallied behind Mussolini when he promised to solve all of their problems for them. Mussolini pressured the King of Italy to make him prime minister, and he used his new position to turn Italy into a dictatorship with himself at the center, leading to the first fascist dictator in Europe. On to the next slide, we're going to take a look at Germany's rise to fascism. After World War I, Germany took the vast majority of blame and punishment for starting World War I, even though this wasn't necessarily true. They had their army severely limited, lost a lot of territory, and went into a massive recession due to their debt to the Allied nations. Adolf Hitler rose as a voice of power to the German people, claiming he could fix their problems and promising that they would have revenge on the Allies in the future, causing the German people to rally behind him and his government. Because of this, and his growing popularity, he was made the Chancellor of Germany. And after the death of Germany's president, Hitler was able to create a dictatorship with himself at the center. Europe now had fascist dictator number 2. So, on to slide number 5, we're going to take a look at the rise of fascism in Spain. Now that fascism was on the rise in some of Europe's biggest countries, it was only a matter of time before it spread elsewhere. And in 1931, Spain got rid of their monarchy and established a republic. Many in Spain were big supporters of the monarchy and didn't really want to see the rise of a republic, and started aligning with right-wing movements throughout the country. In 1936, right-wing groups lost an election to leftist groups within the country, causing the country to become extremely divided. Pretty much a line straight down the middle with people on the far right and the far left. One of the nationalists' biggest supporters was a general named Francisco Franco, who was a Spanish general in Morocco. He was a conservative and a monarchist and heavily opposed the creation of a republic. Franco followed other generals in a failed coup that preceded the Spanish Civil War, and after the coup failed and many of the generals were caught, he was left as the group's real only leader. This caused him to declare Spain to be a monarchy and declared himself as the regent. So essentially, Spain was a monarchy without a king present, and he was essentially the sole ruler of the country in his own mind. And this is really when the Spanish Civil War began. So, on to slide number 6. There were two distinct sides in the Spanish Civil War. The Republicans were a loosely organized group of people who supported the Republic, communists and anarchists, and there was really no unity between the groups. They were kind of just a ragtag group of different ideologies that did not want the nationalists to win. They were supported by the Soviet Union and Mexico and volunteers from many nations that opposed fascism. Unfortunately, nations like France and the UK were a little too nervous to get involved, which is a very common theme with all the conflicts leading up to World War II. And this limited a lot of potential aid that the Republicans could have had. On the other side of the war were the nationalists, who were supported by fascists. This group was solely united under Franco and the fascist ideology. They were a much more effective fighting force of Spanish generals and soldiers. They saw massive support from other fascist governments who wanted to see their new ideology spread to other nations, since this was still a pretty new ideology at the time. And this aid mainly came from Germany and Italy, which is going to be the bulk of my presentation. So, on to slide number 7, I'm going to take a look at the Italian role. The Italians easily played the biggest role in supporting Franco during the Civil War. They honestly probably gave them a little bit too much support. A man named Galeazzo Ciano was the Italian Minister of Foreign Relations, and he was also Mussolini's son-in-law. And he was responsible for relations with Franco at the time of the Spanish Civil War. Italian had very close relations with right-wing groups in Spain, even before the Civil War, and they had promised support if there was ever to be a military coup in the country. In 1934, Mussolini personally visited Spanish monarchists and promised military support and funding in the future, leading many to see Italy as really the nation that was the spark for the Spanish Civil War to even be able to occur. Italy saw the Spanish Civil War as sort of a preparation for what they saw as an inevitable war of ideologies in Europe, which would happen in the next 4 years. In 1936, the Civil War began, and since Franco and most of his army were still in Morocco, Italy sent planes to help transport Spanish troops to Franco's Army of Africa into mainland Spain. By 1937, 50,000 Italian troops were on the ground in Spain, along with ground support. Italy stationed their air force in the Mediterranean as well, in order to prevent any aid getting to the Republicans. In March of 1937, Mussolini suffered a very embarrassing defeat to a group of international volunteers who were severely outnumbered and ended up massacring the bulk of Italy's forces in that area. This caused Mussolini to stay in Italy because Italian intervention had now become personal to him, because he felt that he needed to restore the honor of Italy's troops. Italian forces increased to 75,000 ground troops in Spain, and Italian officers were installed in Franco's general staff. The Italians also offered their navy to Franco, which was used to blockade the Soviet Union and prevent aid to the Republicans. During this blockade, a British ship was sunk, resulting in international condemnation of Italy and further distancing fascist governments from the rest of Europe. The Italian secret police, or the OVRA, which stands for the Organization of Vigilance and Repression of Anti-Fascism, were also put in Spain to assassinate anti-fascist individuals that might hinder Franco's success in the Civil War. Altogether, Italy played a much bigger role in the Civil War than Germany did, with 75,000 Italian troops in Spain and Italians staying on with Franco's general staff even after the Civil War. Italy also wasted a lot of resources in the Spanish Civil War. They wasted a lot of men, a lot of money, and a lot of vehicles, which they ended up not having enough for World War II in the coming years, and this was a big reason for their very poor performance in World War II. Moving on to slide 10, we're going to look at the Germans' role next. While Italy sought an ally from the Spanish Civil War in Spain, Hitler really didn't care to form a friendship with Franco. He had much different goals. His goals in Europe were less ideologically based and more based around ethnicity. He wanted the Aryan race to rule over Europe in the end. He wanted German people to rule all of Europe, and he was using Spain and Italy just to sort of help him along the way. And he saw the Spanish and Italians as inferior to his own people. Hitler also hated communists and sort of used this as an excuse to be in a war against the Republicans, and wanted to stop them from winning in any way possible. His government was also hated by most European governments, so he assumed that if nationalist Spain won, he'd have a pretty important trade partner and someone would actually be able to trade with him. And finally, he really wanted to surround France with fascism, because France is one of Germany's just oldest enemies. And if the nationalists won, then France would be surrounded on all sides by what they called the triangle of fascism in nationalist Spain, Italy, and Germany. Similar to Italy, Hitler used the Spanish Civil War as an opportunity to test out his new armed forces. After the Treaty of Versailles, Germany's army was essentially disbanded. So most of the German army at the time of the Civil War was pretty inexperienced and pretty new. This was also the first test for the Luftwaffe, which would become notorious as Germany's dangerously effective air force during World War II and during the Blitzkrieg. Germany created the Condor Legion as well, which was a regiment completely made up of German volunteers to act as ground troops in Spain and help train Spanish troops. Germany also, along with Italy, donated many planes to carry the bulk of Franco's army from Morocco to mainland Spain. While Italy supported Franco with tens of thousands of troops, Germany mainly provided air support, and they were very, very carefree with this. They also only had, by 1937, they also only had 7,000 troops in Spain as compared to Italy's 75,000, so they were really dwarfed compared to Italy. The Germans were also much less interested in helping Spain for an alliance, as I mentioned before, and they had little regard for the Spanish people. And this can be seen when the Luftwaffe were proven to be bombing civilian targets and ended up killing hundreds of Spanish civilians, and they received international condemnation for this. In total, by the end of the war, the Germans had sent 16,000 men and sent $250 million US dollars, or the equivalent of $215 million US dollars to nationalist Spain as aid, which again was absolutely dwarfed by Italy's contribution. So in total, going on to slide 13, total fascist support. Italy sent a lot more support to nationalist Spain than Germany. Italy sought a permanent fascist ally in Spain that could help them for many years in the future. Italy was very politically motivated. They wanted power after the Spanish Civil War. They wanted more fascist allies to help them out in the coming years. They treated Spain as an ally and a friend rather than working for their own benefits. And Italy ended up hurting their economy a lot more than, and Spain didn't even participate in World War II. So they really ended up hurting their economy for no reason. And they had a very poor performance in Africa and the Italian front in World War II. Germany sent minimal support to Franco. He helped them in order to support their own agenda of stopping communism from spreading and helping their economy. He also wanted to threaten his own enemies in France and even the UK, because just any increase in fascism in Europe would severely threaten any democratic governments. He had no regard for the Spanish people and ended up killing hundreds of Spanish civilians in bombing raids that were completely unnecessary. And Hitler and Franco just never got along. Hitler was just so hell-bent on himself being in charge, himself being in power, and just controlling all of Europe. That is mainly why Franco didn't participate in World War II. So, on to the slide 14 for the discussion questions. I had two questions. My main one is, if World War I had never occurred, do any of you think Franco or fascism would have ever spread in Europe? Because as I mentioned before, World War I was sort of when governments saw that wars could seriously change the layout of European governments. Monarchies were ended, empires were destroyed, and a lot of people saw this as an opportunity to take control through warfare. So if World War I had never occurred, do you think fascism could have ever grown in Europe? And this is less of a discussion question, but just sort of a poll. Many people don't know Mussolini was the creator of fascism. I feel like most people think it was Germany within the Nazis. So who do you think was fascism's creator before this presentation? And then slide 15 has my sources. Thank you.